Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the world had seen before. While wars in the past had been fought in open fields, deserts, or urban environments, the struggle in Vietnam was waged in some of the most treacherous terrain imaginable. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, deeply familiar with the land, utilized the dense jungles, towering mountains, and sprawling underground tunnel systems to their advantage, turning the natural landscape into a formidable ally against the foreign invaders. The majority of the battles took place in the heart of the jungle, where the thick canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight, casting the forest floor into perpetual shadow. The air was heavy with humidity, and the constant sound of insects, birds, and unseen creatures created an oppressive atmosphere that weighed heavily on the soldiers' minds. Visibility was often limited to just a few feet, making it nearly impossible to spot the enemy until they were practically on top of you. For the soldiers of the United States and their allies, this environment was not only foreign, but utterly hostile. The thick undergrowth made movements slow and noisy, a fact the Viet Cong exploited with deadly efficiency. Ambushes were frequent and devastating, with booby traps and landmines hidden along the trails that crisscrossed the jungle. The soldiers had to be constantly vigilant, knowing that one wrong step could mean instant death. But it wasn't just the enemy that made operations difficult. The very land itself seemed to conspire against the soldiers. The tropical climate brought with it monsoon rains that turned the ground to thick mud, making it nearly impossible for vehicles to traverse and forcing troops to slog through the mire on foot. The mountains, steep and covered in slippery vegetation, posed their own challenges, making it difficult to maintain supply lines and communicate between units. In these remote areas, the soldiers faced a constant battle not only against the Viet Cong, but against the elements. Diseases such as malaria and dysentery were rampant, taking their toll on the already weary troops. The heat was relentless, sapping the energy from even the strongest men, while the nights brought a cold that seeped into their bones as they huddled in their makeshift camps. Navigating this hostile environment required not only physical endurance, but a sharp mind and an unwavering sense of discipline. The enemy knew the jungle intimately, using it to their advantage in ways that left the foreign forces constantly on edge. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig could signal an impending attack, and the soldiers learned quickly to trust their instincts if they wanted to survive. Amidst this chaos, securing and holding strategic positions became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Camps and bases changed hands frequently, with each side trying to gain the upper hand by occupying key locations, only to abandon them when the situation became untenable. The abandoned camps, like the one that the First Company was ordered to investigate, stood as silent reminders of battles won and lost, their empty structures now reclaimed by the jungle, hiding secrets and stories of those who had once fought and died there. These operations were as much a test of willpower as they were of military might. The soldiers had to push through exhaustion, fear, and the ever-present danger of the unknown as they moved deeper into enemy territory, where each step brought them closer to the possibility of a deadly encounter. In this unforgiving landscape, every mission became a struggle for survival. The abandoned camp deep in the heart of North Vietnam, shrouded in rumors and fear, was just another challenge to be faced. But for the men of the First Company, it would prove to be unlike any mission they had ever undertaken, as the jungle prepared to reveal its darkest secrets. In the heart of North Vietnam, a war-weary platoon of the First Company gathered in the dimly lit operations tent at their base camp. It was the end of yet another long, grueling day, and the men were exhausted, their faces etched with the strain of a conflict that seemed to have no end. They had seen their share of combat in the dense jungles, fighting an enemy that was as elusive as it was deadly, but tonight, their commanding officer, Captain John Jack Donovan had called them together for a briefing that promised something different, something that would test their resolve in ways they hadn't yet experienced. Captain Donovan, a seasoned veteran with a grizzled beard and steely eyes, stood at the head of the room, flanked by maps of the surrounding terrain. He was a man of few words, known for his calm demeanor even in the face of overwhelming odds. The men respected him, trusted him, because he had led them through hell and back more than once. "Listen up," Donovan began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the assembled soldiers. "We've got a new mission. Intelligence reports have indicated unusual activity at a former Viet Cong base deep in the jungle, near the Laotian border. The place has been abandoned for months, but recently, there have been signs of movement lights seen at night, strange noises, even sightings of what appear to be soldiers. Command wants us to check it out." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard the ghost stories about the abandoned bases that littered the jungle. Places where the Viet Cong had once held strong, but had been forced to abandon to relentless bombing or tactical withdrawals. Places that were now said to be haunted by the spirits of the dead, both friend and foe alike. But the war had taught them to fear the living more than the dead, and they knew better than to let superstition cloud their judgment. "Yes, Captain," one of the soldiers, Sergeant Mike Smitty Smith, asked. Smitty was a solid, dependable soldier, known for his sharp shooting and even sharper wit. He had been with Donovan since the early days, and the two shared a mutual respect, because we're the closest unit with the experience needed to handle this kind of recon, Donovan replied. "And because command trusts us to get the job done without stirring up a hornet's nest. Our orders are to move in, assess the situation, and report back. If it's nothing, we return. If it's something, we prepare for further action." The captain's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The jungle was unpredictable, and so were the missions. What started as a simple recon could quickly turn into a firefight. Or worse, preparations began immediately. The men checked and double-checked their gear, ensuring their weapons were clean and their ammunition was plentiful. They packed rations, medical supplies, and extra water, anything they might need for a mission that could last days. The jungle was unforgiving, and they had learned the hard way that being underprepared was a death sentence. As night fell, the men gathered around the fire for one last briefing. Captain Donovan laid out the plan. They would move out at first light, traveling light and fast to reach the abandoned camp by midday. The terrain would be challenging: thick jungle, steep inclines, and narrow trails, but they had navigated worse. Their mission was to approach the camp silently, using the cover of the jungle to observe any activity before making their presence known. Corporal James "Jimmy" Hayes, the youngest in the unit and their resident radio operator, would stay in constant contact with base camp, relaying updates as they advanced. His job was critical. If things went south, he would be their lifeline to reinforcements. As the men settled in for a few hours of restless sleep, Donovan walked the perimeter of the camp, his mind racing. He had been in this war long enough to know that things were rarely as simple as they seemed. The stories about the camp, the recent activity, it all pointed to something more than just an abandoned base, but he kept those thoughts to himself. His men needed to stay focused, not distracted by ghost stories. Dawn broke with a mist that clung to the trees like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the jungle. The men of the first company moved out silently, their boots sinking into the damp earth as they began their trek. The jungle closed in around them, the thick foliage obscuring their path as they followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. The journey was arduous, the heat and humidity sapping their strength with each step. They moved in single file, Donovan leading the way with Smitty close behind, his rifle at the ready. The men were silent, focused, their senses heightened by the knowledge that they were heading into the unknown. Hours passed as they pushed through the jungle, the landscape growing more rugged and unforgiving with each mile. The trail became steeper, the air thicker, and the jungle seemed to close in around them, as if trying to swallow them whole. But the men pressed on, driven by duty and the unspoken bond that had formed between them over months of fighting side by side. By midday, they had reached the outskirts of the abandoned camp. Donovan signaled for the men to halt, crouching low as he surveyed the area through his binoculars. The camp was eerily quiet, the structures barely visible through the dense undergrowth that had begun to reclaim the land. There were no signs of life, no movement, just the oppressive silence of a place that had seen too much death. But something felt off. Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. He lowered the binoculars and turned to his men, their faces tense with anticipation. "All right, we move in slow," Donovan whispered. "Stay sharp and keep your eyes peeled. This place might be abandoned, but we're not taking any chances." With a nod, the men fanned out, moving cautiously toward the camp. As they approached, the silence grew heavier, as if the jungle itself was warning them to turn back. But they were soldiers, and their mission was clear. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The abandoned camp loomed before them, a relic of a war that had taken so much and given so little in return. And as they crossed the threshold, stepping into the unknown, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had just entered a place where the past and the present were about to collide in ways they could never have imagined. Day 1. Under the dim light of the sun struggling to break through thick clouds, the soldiers of the 1st Company of the United States Army had been given a daunting task. They were to investigate an abandoned military camp deep in the jungles of North Vietnam, a camp that had once served as a stronghold for the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. The mission was shrouded in mystery, with rumors circulating among the soldiers about the place. Some said it was haunted, others dismissed it as mere superstition. But all would soon discover the truth. The captain of the company, Captain John Harrison, a seasoned and pragmatic leader, gathered his men for a briefing as they stood in the clearing just outside the dense jungle that led to the camp. "All right, listen up." Captain Harrison's voice was firm, cutting through the murmurs among the men. "We've been tasked with securing this old camp. Command wants us to sweep the area, make sure there's no remaining hostile presence, and then set up a temporary base. This might seem like just another mission, but I want everyone on high alert. We don't know what we're walking into." The soldiers, a mix of veterans and fresh recruits, stood in attention, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: nervousness, determination, and curiosity. Among them was Private Michael Carter, a young soldier on his first deployment, and Sergeant James Red Donovan, a battle-hardened veteran who had seen more than his fair share of combat. As they began their march through the thick underbrush, the atmosphere grew tense. The jungle was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of unseen creatures. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Hey, Sarge," Private Carter whispered to Sergeant Donovan, trying to keep his voice low. "You ever hear stories about this place? They say it's haunted by the ghosts of the soldiers who never left." Donovan gave a slight smirk, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "I've heard plenty of ghost stories in my time, Carter. But ghosts don't scare me, ambushes do. Keep your eyes peeled, and your rifle ready. Whatever's out here, living or dead, we'll deal with it." As the company pressed on, they finally reached the edge of the abandoned camp. The once formidable outpost was now in ruins, overgrown with vegetation, and consumed by nature. The air grew thick with an unspoken tension as they crossed the threshold into the camp. "Spread out and check the perimeter," Captain Harrison ordered. "I want a full report in 10 minutes." The soldiers moved cautiously, their boots crunching on the gravel paths that wound between the dilapidated barracks and resting equipment. As they searched the area, the unsettling feeling of being watched began to creep into their minds. Private Carter and his squad approached one of the old bunkers. The door was partially ajar, and a cold draft seemed to emanate from within. With a nod from Sergeant Donovan, Carter pushed the door open, his rifle raised. Inside, the bunker was dark and musty, The walls were covered in faded maps and propaganda posters, remnants of the war that had once raged here. As they swept their flashlights around, something caught Carter's eye, a shadow that seemed to move against the wall, separate from the beams of their lights. "Sarge, did you see that?" Carter asked, his voice trembling slightly. Donovan turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. "See what?" Before Carter could respond, they heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper. It seemed to come from all around them, yet from nowhere at all. "Get out." The voice was low, filled with a sense of dread that chilled them to the bone. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, the bravado of the moment before vanishing in an instant. Suddenly, one of the men, Private Thomas, a tough and confident soldier, stumbled back, his face pale. I saw something. A figure, just standing there, in the corner, but when they pointed their flashlights, there was nothing. Just empty space and shadows playing tricks on their minds. Or was it? Everyone stay calm. Sergeant Donovan barked, trying to regain control of the situation. "We're not here to chase shadows. Let's finish our sweep and report back." As they exited the bunker, the whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder, more insistent. Each soldier felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them, the cold touch of the past reaching out from the shadows. When they regrouped with the rest of the company, the expressions on their faces told a story words could not. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just an ordinary abandoned camp. Captain Harrison could sense the change in his men. "Report." Sergeant Donovan stepped forward, hesitating before he spoke. "Sir, we found nothing physically threatening, but there's something off about this place. I suggest we stay on high alert tonight." Harrison nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Agreed. We'll set up camp, but I want watches doubled. If there's anything or anyone out there, we'll be ready." As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the jungle, the soldiers prepared for a long and uneasy night. But deep down, each of them knew that this was just the beginning. The ghosts of the past were stirring, and they had come to life in the shadows of the abandoned camp. The first company had successfully infiltrated the perimeter of the abandoned Viet Cong base by late afternoon. The camp, once a hub of activity, was now a haunting shell of its former self. Rusting vehicles were half buried in the thick undergrowth, and the remnants of hastily erected structures sagged under the weight of time and neglect. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth, and an unsettling silence hung over the camp, broken only by the distant calls of jungle creatures. Captain Donovan signaled for the men to spread out and begin their reconnaissance. Each soldier had a specific area to cover, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of seasoned veterans. Corporal Jimmy Hayes set up the radio in what was once the camp's command center, a small, half-collapsed building at the heart of the base. Smitty and Private Dan Doc Williams, the company medic, began surveying the barracks, while Sergeant Rick Tex Carter, the team's demolitions expert, made his way to the old supply depot. The sun dipped low on the horizon as the men worked, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. As the darkness encroached, a sense of unease began to settle over the camp. The men had been in dangerous situations before, but there was something different about this place, something that gnawed at the edge of their consciousness, like a whisper they couldn't quite hear. Smitty and Doc were the first to notice it as they explored the barracks. The building was in shambles, with broken furniture scattered across the floor and walls pocked with bullet holes. But it wasn't the physical damage that caught their attention. It was the feeling that they weren't alone. "You feel that?" Smitty asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he scanned the dark corners of the room. Doc nodded, his hand instinctively tightening around his rifle. "Yeah, it's like someone's watching us." Smitty moved to the window, peering out into the growing darkness. The jungle was eerily still, the usual cacophony of insects and birds strangely absent. He turned back to Doc, his expression grim. "Stay sharp. Let's finish up here and get back to the others. Meanwhile, Captain Donovan was making his way through what appeared to be the camp's mess hall. The building was a mess of overturned tables and rusted kitchen equipment. As he moved through the space, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was a sensation he had learned to trust over the years, one that had saved his life more than once. Pausing, he listened intently, the only sound his own breathing and the faint creaking of the building settling in the cooling night air. But there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against fabric. It was so faint that it could have been his imagination, but Donovan knew better than to dismiss it. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady as he slowly drew his sidearm. Silence. He moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, his footsteps light on the creaking floorboards. As he rounded a corner, his flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the room. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure dressed in tattered Viet Cong fatigues, standing at attention as if waiting for orders. But when the light steadied, the figure was gone. Donovan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He swept the beam of light across the room again, but there was nothing, only shadows and dust. Shaking off the encounter, he continued his sweep, but the sense of unease lingered. This place wasn't just abandoned, it felt wrong, as if the very air was thick with the remnants of something dark and unfinished. Back at the command center, Jimmy was hunched over the radio, trying to make contact with base camp. But the radio was acting up, emitting only static and garbled transmissions. He adjusted the frequency, but nothing came through clearly. "Captain, we've got a problem with the radio," Jimmy reported as Donovan entered the building. Donovan frowned, moving to examine the equipment. "What's wrong with it?" "I don't know, sir. It was fine earlier, but now it's just this," Jimmy replied, frustration creeping into his voice as he gestured to the crackling static. Donovan glanced at the darkening sky outside. "Keep trying, we need to maintain contact." As the night deepened, the men regrouped to discuss their findings. There was little to report, no sign of recent activity, no indication that anyone had been in the camp for months, maybe even years, but the unease they all felt was palpable. "Something's not right here," Tex muttered, his eyes scanning the jungle that encircled them like a living, breathing entity. "We're not alone, Captain," Smitty added, his voice low. "Doc and I felt it too, in the barracks, like someone or something was watching us." Donovan nodded. He had felt it too, in the mess hall. But he wasn't about to let fear take hold of his men. They had a job to do, and they would see it through. "Stay focused," he said firmly. "We set up a perimeter, double watch shifts tonight. If anything moves out there, I want to know about it." The men nodded, their faces grim as they moved to their assigned positions. The jungle seemed to press in around them as the darkness deepened, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a night bird. Hours passed slowly as the men kept watch. The night was heavy, the air thick with moisture, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The men were on edge, their senses heightened by the strange atmosphere of the camp. Then, just after midnight, it happened. Private Paul Red Edwards, a quiet soldier with a reputation for being unflappable, was on watch near the perimeter when he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like footsteps on the hard-packed earth. He strained to see through the darkness, his eyes scanning the trees just beyond the edge of the camp. There, just at the edge of his vision, he saw movement. A shadow, barely discernible against the blackness of the jungle. Red tightened his grip on his rifle, his heart pounding. He watched as the shadow moved closer, taking on the vague outline of a figure, a soldier, dressed in what looked like old Viet Cong fatigues. "Identify yourself," Red called out, his voice steady but laced with tension. The figure paused, then began to move forward again, the footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. Red raised his rifle, aiming directly at the approaching figure. "I said, identify yourself," he repeated, louder this time. But the figure did not respond. Instead, It continued to advance, its movements slow and deliberate. As it stepped into the faint light cast by the camp's perimeter, Red felt a chill run down his spine. The figure was clearly a soldier, but its face was obscured, as if shrouded in shadow. It was as if the darkness itself clung to the figure, refusing to let go. Without warning, the figure stopped, standing just outside the perimeter, its face still hidden in shadow. Red's finger hovered over the trigger, his instinct screaming at him to fire. But something held him back, a deep, primal fear that froze him in place. Then, the figure slowly raised its hand, pointing directly at Red. Red's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back, his mind racing. The figure's presence was wrong and natural. He wanted to pull the trigger, to eliminate the threat, but his body refused to obey. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to fade, its outline blurring and dissolving into the night. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving Red standing alone, his heart pounding in the suffocating silence. Red lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. He knew what he had seen, but it defied explanation. He turned and sprinted back to the command center, where Donovan and the others were huddled around the radio. "Captain," Red gasped, bursting into the room. I saw something out there, a soldier Viet Cong, I think. But it wasn't right, sir. It wasn't human." The men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier sense of dread now fully realized. Donovan locked eyes with Red, seeing the fear in the young soldier's eyes. "Everyone stays on high alert," Donovan ordered, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "Whatever that was, it's not going to catch us off guard again." The rest of the night passed in tense silence, with the men scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But nothing else appeared, and as dawn approached, the jungle remained as eerily quiet as it had been the night before. But the damage had been done. The men of the first company knew they were not alone in that abandoned camp. Something or someone was watching them, waiting. And as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, they couldn't shake the feeling that the jungle around them was alive with unseen eyes. As the first light of dawn broke through the dense canopy of the jungle, the men of the first company gathered in the makeshift mess area, bleary-eyed and on edge. The night had been long, filled with tension and an unsettling silence that none of them could shake. The only sounds now were the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird as the jungle slowly came to life with the new day. The soldiers were unusually quiet as they ate their rations, the memory of the previous night still fresh in their minds. The story of Red's encounter with the shadowy figure had spread like wildfire through the camp. By morning, every man had heard it, and the reactions were mixed. Private Smitty was the first to break the silence, chuckling as he nudged Doc with his elbow. "So, Red, you gonna tell us more about that ghost soldier you saw last night? Maybe he was just lost and needed directions." A few of the other soldiers laughed, though the sound was strained, betraying their unease. Red forced a grin, though the fear from the night before still lingered in his eyes. "Yeah, real funny, Smitty," Red replied, trying to keep his voice light. "Next time, I'll ask him for his orders." Sergeant Carter, or Tex as the men called him, smirked as he sipped his coffee. Sounds like Red here was just seeing things in the dark. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or his imagination running wild. But despite the attempts to make light of the situation, there was an undercurrent of tension that none of them could ignore. The soldiers who had been on watch the previous night knew what they had felt: an oppressive, almost malevolent presence that defied explanation. Private Johnson, one of the newer recruits, glanced around nervously. "You guys really think it was just his imagination? I mean, I don't know about you, but that place gives me the creeps." Doc, who had been unusually quiet, nodded slowly. "There's something off about this camp, something I can't quite put my finger on. It's like the air's too thick, you know, like it's choking you." Captain Donovan entered the area, his expression unreadable as he joined the group. The men quickly straightened up, their chatter subsiding as they focused on their commander. Donovan had heard the talk circulating through the ranks, and while he appreciated the attempts to keep morale up, he knew the seriousness of what had happened. "All right, listen up," Donovan began, his voice firm but calm. "I know some of you had a rough night. Whatever Red saw or didn't see, we're still here to do a job. We need to stay focused and keep our heads on straight." Smitty, ever the joker, tried to lighten the mood again. "So, Cap, are we hunting ghosts now? Maybe we should get Red a camera so he can prove it next time." A few men laughed, but Donovan's stern gaze silenced them quickly. He wasn't in the mood for jokes, and the men could sense it. "Keep it together, Smitty," Donovan said sharply. "This isn't a joke. I don't care what you believe, what matters is that we keep this camp secure. I expect every one of you to stay alert. No one slacks off, no one lets their guard down, understood?" The men nodded, the gravity of Donovan's words sinking in. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface came back, a reminder that whatever they were dealing with was not to be taken lightly. Tex set down his coffee cup, his expression more serious now. "Cap's right, we can't afford to get spooked. If there's something out there, we'll deal with it like we deal with everything else, with discipline and firepower." Despite the tension, the story of Red's ghostly encounter became the talk of the day, with soldiers teasing him whenever they had the chance. But beneath the humor, there was a shared understanding that the night ahead might bring more of the unknown. When evening fell, the mood in the camp shifted once more. The men who were assigned to the night watch exchanged uneasy glances, the memory of Red's story weighing heavily on them. No one wanted to admit it, but the idea of encountering the same figure, or worse, something they couldn't explain, was enough to make even the toughest among them anxious. As the camp settled into the night, the soldiers on duty were more vigilant than ever, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. No one dared to sleep on their watch, and even those who weren't on duty found it hard to drift off, their minds racing with thoughts of what might be lurking just beyond the trees. The camp had taken on a different atmosphere. The soldiers knew they were being watched, but by what or whom, they couldn't say. And though they tried to laugh it off during the day, the night was an entirely different story, one that none of them could escape. As night fell on the second day at the abandoned camp, the men of the first company found themselves more on edge than they had been the night before. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the thick foliage and towering trees casting long shadows that played tricks on their minds. The air was heavy with humidity, and a sense of foreboding hung over the camp like a dark cloud. The soldiers who had experienced strange occurrences the previous night were especially wary. They huddled around the dim light of their campfire, speaking in hushed tones about what they had seen and felt. Despite their attempts to brush off the events as mere figments of their imagination, the fear lingered just beneath the surface. Corporal Davis, one of the more seasoned soldiers, sat sharpening his knife while listening to the others talk. "I'm telling you," he said quietly, "there's something not right about this place. I don't care what anyone says, we're not alone here." Private Johnson, still shaken from the first night, nodded in agreement. "I felt it too. Davis, it's like there's something watching us, waiting for the right moment." Smitty, ever the skeptic, scoffed, "You guys are just letting your nerves get the best of you. We're in the middle of the jungle, for Christ's sake. Of course, it's going to feel creepy." But even Smitty couldn't entirely dismiss the unease he felt. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and distant animal calls, but every so often, there was a silence that felt unnatural, as if the very forest was holding its breath. As the night wore on, the soldiers began their shifts. Those on guard duty were particularly vigilant, their eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The minutes seemed to drag on in 2 hours, and fatigue set in, but none of them dared to let their guard down. Around midnight, just as the jungle seemed to settle into an eerie stillness, Private Garcia, who was on watch, thought he saw something moving in the trees. His heart raced as he peered into the darkness, his hand tightening on his rifle. At first, he thought it was just an animal, but then he saw a faint, almost ghostly figure moving silently between the trees. "Did you see that?" Garcia whispered to his fellow soldier, privately, who was stationed nearby. Lee squinted into the darkness, but saw nothing. "See what? It's just the wind, Garcia. You're imagining things." But Garcia was certain of what he had seen. He could feel his pulse quickening, fear taking hold of him. He wanted to call out, to alert the others, but he hesitated, unsure if he would sound crazy. Just as he was about to say something, the figure seemed to vanish, melting back into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. Garcia was left staring into the void, his mind racing. The rest of the night passed slowly, with each soldier experiencing their own unsettling encounter, strange whispers on the wind, the feeling of being watched, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. By morning, the tension in the camp was palpable. When dawn finally broke, the soldiers gathered once again, this time in an even more subdued mood. The stories from the night before spread quickly, with each man recounting his own eerie experience. Some of the men laughed nervously, trying to downplay their fear, but it was clear that the night had taken a toll on them. Sergeant Carter, who had managed to get a few hours of sleep, joined the group with a serious expression. "All right, what's the latest ghost story? Or are we just going to keep scaring ourselves until we're all too freaked out to sleep?" Smitty, who had been one of the loudest skeptics, now wore a more thoughtful expression. "Maybe there's something to it. Sarge, Garcia here says he saw something last night. And it's not just him. A few others did too?" The men murmured in agreement, and Garcia, though still shaken, nodded. "I saw something. Sarge, it wasn't just in my head." Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I don't know what's out there, but we can't let it get to us. We've got a job to do, and we need to stay focused. No more ghost stories, all right. At least not while we're on duty." Despite Carter's efforts to keep things in check, the stories persisted, and as the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences continued. Some soldiers started to see the haunting experiences as part of life in the camp, while others were pushed to the brink, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in the shadows. As the weeks passed, the camp's reputation grew among the soldiers. Stories of ghostly apparitions, eerie sounds, and inexplicable occurrences became the stuff of legend. The men who rotated in for their shifts would often laugh off the tales, only to find themselves recounting their own experiences by the end of their stay. Private Thompson, a hardened veteran with no patience for superstition, found himself waking in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside his tent. He rushed outside, rifle in hand, only to find nothing but the still, suffocating darkness. When he returned to his tent, he swore he heard a whisper, faint and chilling, just before he fell back into an uneasy sleep. Corporal Davis, who had initially dismissed the stories as mere nerves, became one of the most vocal believers after he experienced a cold, ghostly hand brushing against his arm while he was on watch. The sensation left him rattled, and he began to carry a small charm his mother had given him for protection, something he had previously scoffed at. Even Smitty, who had mocked the others for their fear, started to sleep with a knife under his pillow. The once lively and cheerful soldier was now quieter, his laughter less frequent as the weight of the camp's strange happenings bore down on him. The nights grew longer and more difficult for the soldiers. Sleep became a rare commodity, as the fear of what might happen in the darkness kept them awake. Those assigned to the night watch would often refuse to sleep during the day, their nerves frayed from the constant strain of being on alert. And yet, despite the fear, the soldiers continued to laugh off their experiences when the sun was up. It became a coping mechanism, a way to keep the terror at bay. They would joke about the ghosts, daring each other to explore the darkest corners of the camp or to stand guard alone in the most haunted spots. But deep down, they all knew that the laughter was a thin veil, barely hiding the dread that consumed them. The abandoned camp had taken on a life of its own, and the soldiers were just visitors, passing through a place where the past refused to die. For 6 long months, the stories continued, each one more terrifying than the last. By the time their tour was over, the men of the first company were relieved to leave the camp behind. But the memories of what they had experienced lingered, haunting their thoughts long after they had returned to the safety of civilization. And the camp, with its dark history and restless spirits, remained waiting for the next group of soldiers to arrive, and for the cycle of fear and survival to begin anew. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.